So, welcome. My name is Cindy Lopez, and I'm the Director of Community Engagement and Education here at CHC. We call it Community Connections. Really glad that you're here tonight, and I know it's probably the end of a busy day. Most of you teachers, yes, right? Teachers? Parents? Okay. So, this session is really directed toward teachers in the classroom, but your parents, I'm sure you'll pick up some good tools and strategies too. And how about, let's look at grade levels. So primary grades, 1 through 3? Okay. And what about 4 through 6? Okay. Or middle school? High school? Okay. So we have more in the elementary. Great. Okay. So just a little bit about me. So I've been here at CHC about 9 years. My background is I have about 30 years in education between being a teacher and administrator in public and independent schools. I was actually hired here at CHC about 9 years ago to start Sand Hill School. And I transitioned from that role a couple of years ago into this. So how many already familiar with CHC? Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I do want to say just a couple things. One is, so CHC has been here in our community for over 65 years. So we're local, we're really connected, and we want to stay connected to this community. We want to hear what's going on, and we want to meet needs where we can. We're all about helping kids in lots of different ways. Children, teens, and young adults and families. Our mission is to remove barriers to learning and helping children, teens, and young adults become resilient and happy. So removing barriers for us is about language, location, and finances. So we have many of our clinicians, our psychologists, psychiatrists, all those folks are bilingual. Location, this is our main location, but we also have a location in the South Bay in San Jose, where we have a clinic and a second site for Esther B. Clark School. And then we have work that we do in Ravenswood and East Palo Alto. And then finances, most of what we do in community connections is what you're experiencing tonight is free. We do some fee-based, but most of it's free. And also, we provide lots of financial aid in our schools and in our clinic. So we want to make sure that people have access to the resources that they need. We're looking at the whole child, so just not a piece. We're not just going to look at anxiety, but what are all the pieces of that? Where is that coming from? And specifically, our areas of excellence around ADHD, learning differences like dyslexia, and then anxiety, depression, and autism. We have 4 divisions, 2 schools, and our clinical services, and then our community education, which is what you're participating in tonight. And CHC is an inclusive environment. We want everyone to feel accepted and safe, and to get access to the resources they need. So let's jump into the agenda. So we're going to talk a little bit about what executive function is. I'm going to kind of breeze through that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. The definitions are written down there because I think a lot of the other stuff is more interesting for you. So what's the progression? What does it look like? What does that look like if a child is kind of typically developing? What would that look like for executive function? What are we seeing? If it's not really working, what are we seeing? And the team of executive function, and it's a cool tool that my colleague here, Chris Harris, who's our chief schools officer, developed as he was looking at some research. And I think that'll be a really helpful tool for you to use as you leave tonight. Then strategies for the classroom, and then some time for questions. So hopefully my goal is to finish, 4:30 to 6. So finish by about 5:45 or 5:40, so we have time for some Q&A. So what is executive function? The tricky thing about executive function is there's no standard definition. So you can look at different researchers, and they all say slightly different things, but the big thing is around self-regulation and self-directed activities. So Russell Barkley is one of the big ones. He's big in ADHD and executive function. And so it's all about, again, self-directed actions. See, and you know, a lot of goal accomplishing. How do you set them? How do you get there? What do you do when you got there? How do you know that you got there? And then also Stuss and Alexander have done a lot of work too, and they are, they're out of Canada. So another group called Cognitive Connections actually put this operational definition together. So you've looked at those other two, that's like all the kind of jargon. Here's what you might see in the classroom, right? You want kids to be able to demonstrate situational awareness, to predict outcomes, to generate a plan, to initiate, to monitor, to self-monitor, and to shift or to modify their performance, and then see what happens. So all those things are what we want to see, and that's kind of what those other two definitions said in a kind of operational way. So when we look at the development of executive functioning, first let me say, and you all know this because you're here, that for a lot of our students, a lot of these executive functioning skills and these tasks that have not fully developed in their prefrontal cortex, it's frustrating for them. So you're going to see them acting out against doing a task. You're going to see them escaping or avoiding, shutting down or withdrawing. So those are not, they're not trying to push your buttons. They're really saying that I don't know how to do this. And what happens is students look around and say, why is everyone else doing this and I'm not? Like, what's wrong with me? So it just further reinforces a kind of negative self-image. And by the way, the other thing about this is that it's all in your prefrontal cortex, right? It's your frontal lobes. Well, that's not fully developed until mid-20s. So if you're asking students to do things that they're not really capable of doing, you're going to run into problems. So, and then, of course, we wonder why our 18 and 20-year-olds, as that was actually a quote from Chris Harris, are making such seemingly harebrained decisions. So the next few slides should talk about the progression of executive functioning. So you can see at 5 to 8 years old, they should be able to do these kinds of things, right? 2 to 3 step directions with a prompt. They understand what it means to clean up after an activity. They can initiate and carry through on simple self-help things. They can bring materials to and from school if if it's predictable. And they're capable of doing 10 to 15 minutes of autonomous schoolwork. So think about that. Think about your students. And we're going to come back to these slides again. Hold on. So then at the next level, 9 to 12 years, they're doing like a longer assignment, 2 to 3 days. They can adjust to schedule changes. They understand the concept of saving up for something, and they can delay that gratification. They can self-manage, and they can attend to a task for 20 to 25 minutes. So again, think about your students, your kids. Like, where are they in this? Think about their age, their chronological age, and then think about where they are developmentally here. And then 13 to 16, I'm not going to read it all, but you can see it's that progression of development. They should be able to focus on a task now for 30 to 45 minutes. They can plan for and discipline themselves to complete more complex multi-step projects. And they can focus on schoolwork for maybe an hour at a time and switch from one subject to another. So look back at that progression of skills. Think about chronologically where your students are at, but then look and see, are there ones, so if you're a 4th grade teacher, right, you look at that, is it 9 to 12? That 9 to 12 slide, and say, are there students that you know that don't fit in? Like they're missing something here. And then look at the next one up. Are there things that you're expecting of them that is really not developmentally appropriate for them? And the one below, like, ooh, are there some of your kids who really are developmentally at a different kind of chronological age? So take a minute and think about that, and then maybe just talk with the person around you or sitting next to you a little bit about that, and anything that any ahas that come from that. And then if you want to, hopefully, some of you will want to share afterwards. So I'll give you 3 or 4 minutes to think about that and talk a little bit. So let's come back together. I know. Flip the light switches. Yes. 1, 2, 3, eyes on me. So anyone care to share anything that came out of that for them? Did you recognize some things about students in your classroom or your own kids? Go ahead.
Surprise. I teach middle school. And would they say they are between 12 and 16? I felt 13. I think very few are there.
Mm-hmm. I felt like that too.
Yeah.
Like I have 17-year-old sons and I'm like,
no.
13-year-olds can do this because my 7-year-olds can't.
Okay. Yeah.
And similarly, I noticed it was a cool exercise to see where I teach 5th and 6th grade Spanish right now, and it's just interesting to see where I'm asking them to autonomously maybe keep track of time commitments and okay, maybe I'm trying to be rigorous, but really am I giving them the support that they need? I don't want to set them up for something
Right.
that's beyond. And then also, of course, a few of our young students or students that just need a little bit more support with this that I notice fall in the 5 through 8.
Yeah.
And they're 10.
Yeah. Right.
So kind of I want to know, what can I do for them?
Yeah. Yeah. Did everyone hear that? Okay. Any other thoughts or comments? Yeah.
I was just really curious, since I work with a lot of 5 to 8-year-olds, to look, what's the below that, for the kids who aren't there.
Yes.
Oh, where?
Right. Yes. Like in that preschool range.
What would the descriptor
Yeah, there are definitely those out there. I didn't put them in this one, but you can find those. So some of the resources I gave you tonight in the handouts. Landmark School does a lot of work around executive function. Understood is another great resource. Barclay, Stetson, Alexander, any of those researchers also probably have some. And if you just Google, you'll find a lot. Everybody's talking about it right now. Yes.
I wanted to comment on the destruction that it does to a person's self-esteem to not be able to do these. And I'm speaking from my own experience. I have ADHD and dyslexia. And I was an adult before it occurred to me that I wasn't stupid and lazy. Right now, I'm old enough that people didn't talk about these things when I was a kid.
Yes.
But it really does. I mean, now I work at SB Clark with an entire classroom of kids who can't do all the things I couldn't do. And but it's part of the reason I work here is trying to address the self-esteem issue. You are not dumb or lazy. You just don't know where your folder is.
Right? Yeah. And I think that's important for us to know, and if they could, they would, right? So our kids are not trying to push our buttons. I mean, generally speaking, they would like to do what you would like them to do. I realize that there are other kinds of situations. Not every kid's like that, but just looking through that lens, if they could, they would. If you could just kind of remind yourself of that. I know it's difficult when you're in the classroom and everybody is, falling apart. It's hard to remember that and to remember what what can I do now? But thank you. It's a great reminder for all of us. Any other comments?
I was just going to make that
observation that so much of the assignments now are online, which I see, positive and negative, but it's the positive in that it's tracked.
Yeah.
It shows up in the app and tells them, okay, here's the assignments that you have to do, and right? Which I think is great. Then there's the side of me like, at work, nobody's got an app telling you this is what you need to do.
Right,
That, it's expected of you.
right,
And then focusing mostly on high school students.
yeah,
Even younger grades have the apps that basically.
yeah, right. And there is one of those sheets on the table over there that does have some technology for EF strategies, and those are some of those things. And so I think what we'll find is that our students, they need you to be their kind of external EF coach. They need you to do the prompting and the scaffolding. We want them to become independent and autonomous, and so, but set your goals for them realistically. I think one of the things that happens with, we set a task, we create a task, and we know the skill we want to practice, we want them to practice or we want them to develop, and we create a task, but that task, the EF skills, the EF kind of knowledge that it would take to actually complete the task aren't there. Even though you've targeted the skill, they're not able to complete it because they don't have the executive functioning to complete the task. So you just want to make sure that when you're developing your instruction, that your task and skills are somewhat matched up. And there's a lot, I think we see with Common Core even, that are we're kind of pushing down to earlier grades, some of the things, and expecting more of them. And so it taxes the executive functioning skills, and it taxes the prefrontal cortex in a way that they're not prepared for and that they can't handle, that's underdeveloped. So you're in a difficult spot as a teacher to try and bring all those things together for them. But if you can be that external coach for them, that will really help. So let's look at, so we kind of looked at what's typical, right? How do kids develop? You're going to look at this list and you go, yeah. So as we're going through this list, think about, or put a check mark even by the ones that you observe in your classroom. So no idea what an assignment should look like when it's done. That's actually one thing that lots of students have a hard time with, especially if they're working with ADHD or LD. Like they don't have a picture in their head of what it looks like. You tell them to write a 3-paragraph composition, they don't really know what that looks like. And sometimes it does help to actually create a picture. Like sit down and do the, what is that called? When you actually kind of outline a paragraph. So you did the indentation and the squares, you know what I'm talking about? So actually draw it out, 3 paragraphs. Is that going to be on 1 page or 2 pages, do you think? How many sentences do you think are in a paragraph? So if you get them if you can help them picture what done looks like, that might help them. A group that does really good training around that is called Cognitive Connections. And they do a lot of, their work is based on a lot of Russell Barkley's work. And one of the things that they say the kids don't do well is create that picture in their head of what done looks like. So they do a lot of backwards planning with kids. They start with what done looks like, and they work backwards to get it done and to the materials needed. So poor time planning or material management, anyone in your class, check it out.
I don't know what you're talking
Yeah. Pay attention to the wrong stimuli or not enough attention to the right. Like they don't know. They have difficulty getting started without repeated or direct prompting. And even if they get that direct prompting, they still have a hard time getting started. They fail to sustain sufficient effort or focus. They're prone to quitting. They're slow to respond. They don't complete assignments. Though what they have completed is accurate. It's just that that production piece is not happening for them. They can't remember the steps for solving a problem. The work's generated in reduced volume, and it takes way too long. It takes a longer time than it should. They give in to distracting thoughts, like, ooh, squirrel? Or they can't tell you how or why they were successful or not, right? They don't know. It's like, well, how did you get to this point? I don't know. I just did it. They seem to talk on and on before they actually answer the question. Or they refuse to make adjustments or edit or modify their work. So that's kind of a rigid piece. So you can't remember the steps for solving problems. Sounds like a working memory issue, right? And so if we look at working memory, we're going to go through all that in just a minute, but I wanted to just, as you think about this, that all of these relate back to a weakness in a specific area of executive functioning, that if you could identify or kind of isolate that, you might be a step closer to helping them.
One aspect of problems with executive functioning that I've run into over and over again is that kids with executive functioning problems, actually all of us with executive functioning problems, we often don't use the resources that are available to us. So if I have a kid who can't spell, even if the question has the word in it, the kid will not think to go up and use that. They also might not use anchor charts that are directly in front of them. And it seems like, why aren't you accessing this? But I think it has to do with executive function.
Well, it also, you have to teach them the strategies. Right. So if a strategy is to look at the question and use part of the question in your answer, right? But you have to teach them directly and explicitly how to do that, and then practice it. And then you have to also think about, when you think about teaching kids strategy and strategy instruction, you do those things. I do it, we do it, you do it. Then you actually, part of your assessment of them, if you're grading or whatever, is how well did you use the strategy. So you make it important for them to use the strategy as well. So when any of these components breaks down, it inevitably impacts the performance across all the domains. And they're particularly devastating when, again, we talked about this earlier, when they know they're not functioning like the normal kids, right? And they don't understand why. And it just creates more of that emotional anxiety and, poor self-image, poor self-esteem. So they're going to not be able to really self-manage their obstacles to learning until, one, they get older. Their brain matures. And two, we have to teach them how to work through and use the EF skills they have. And they have some skills, but they may not have developed them. So that's part of your job too, is to say, how can we help cultivate these skills in the classroom? So let's look at this chart. So across the top of this chart, there are what we call the 5 coaches of executive functioning. So you have attention, processing, memory or working memory, emotional control, and planning. And then, so we have the coaches. So think about the analogy of, lots of people talk about analogies when they talk about executive function, about the orchestra or the conductor of the orchestra. In this analogy, it's really like the team, the football team, right? You have a coach and the players. So these across the top, attention, processing, memory, emotional control, and planning are the coaches. And these players, or these sub-skills, are in those columns right underneath them. So the cool thing about this chart is that it can really help you isolate and specify where the areas of breakdown are for your students. So if you have a student who is dealing with attention issues, but you're not sure, like, where is that breakdown happening? So look at these areas: energize, initiate, focus, sustain, engage, and reflect. They are sequential in the sense that if they're not able to energize and initiate, they're not going to be able to get down here to engage and reflect, right? So they kind of have to have some of these in place before they can get to that gauge and reflect. So we're going to talk about each one of these and the players in each one of these. And I think, so hopefully this will be a tool that you go back and you could say, oh, where is this child on the chart, and how can I help? What strategies can I then use to target and to help them cultivate some of those executive function skills? So attention. So the players need that EF attention coach to deploy the others as dictated by how the situation or the task demands, right? So energize, initiate, focus, sustain, engage, and reflect. So the players. So energize, think energize everybody, like what gets them going, right? So off the top of my head, I can say, like, leverage their interests and their strengths. Like, get them engaged in that way. And then so that's like before the task. How are you, that's kind of the front loading, the pre-teaching, those kinds of things really help to energize. And then during the task, initiate, focus, sustain, engage. So initiate, getting started, actually getting started. Focusing, again, on the right stuff. Sticking with it. And then gauging, am I really attending the way I need to? Like, am I really getting this done? So as you think about those things, does anything come to mind to you about, actually, let's go one more down. And then after the activity, after the task is done, take some time, the kids should take some time to reflect. Well, how well did I attend to the task? Did I complete it the way that I think it should be completed? And again, it goes back to that picture in their head, right? They have to have this picture, and that developing that picture in their head is something you can help them with right at the beginning. Like, what does done look like? What would complete look like? And that can happen up in that pre-task. So if you're looking at strategies for initiating or getting started, that lots of times giving them a choice of how to complete the task, and that's where are you all familiar with Universal Design for Learning? Okay. One of the handouts talks about how you can provide multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of expression. So if you look at this and think, what kinds of choices could I give my students that might help them get started a little bit easier, a little bit faster. And again, leveraging their strengths or their interests in terms of choices. Like, does it have to be a written composition? Could there be something else? Or could there be an aspect of it that maybe part of it is written and part of it is an art task or a photo or some other way, something for them to build, some other way. So thinking about Universal Design for Learning is really great in terms of building some of those executive functioning tasks or executive functioning skills. So we're going to have some time. You can ask questions along the way too, but we're going to have some time to actually look at strategies and think about how they relate back to these. So processing. This is a tricky one, just like working memory. So processing and working memory are two things that are really hard to like make big changes with in a child. Companies have developed, whole CogMed, for example, like they've developed whole programs based on this. But when you look at processing, you can see those players or the sub-skills probably the least understood and one of the most impactful. So what are these roles? So select, it's about selecting the right stimuli at the right time to input for an identified purpose. So there's a few things in there, right? Pick the right stimuli at the right time. Be able to identify what comes first, what comes next. First, I should do this, then I can do that, and eventually I'm going to get to the done. Associate, so I can link new information with previously learned concepts. That's going to help, that's going to actually help my working memory too, if I can do that. I'm going to consciously consider several concepts at once and then see how they're connected. That's hard. It depends on kind of where your students are at. And again, consider that, you know, how is the brain mature and where they're at in that process. Pace, speed, fluency, and efficiency. Really tricky for a lot of our kids. And then what generate the actual volume of response that the student produces. So as we look at that, there are strategies that we can align with those. As an example, like sequencing, like create a timeline for a project. If you're assigning a project, create a timeline for a project and help them visually see what comes first, what comes next, where they're going to end up.
And maybe not as a list.
Correct.
A timeline or steps or things like that.
Yes, and the more time you spend, the more time you can spend on helping them develop that picture in their head before they even get started, they're going to be able to recall that and go back to that and say, okay, remember the picture? Then you could even have them draw a picture. Remember, pull that out. What does that look like? How are we going to get there? There are also, you know, timers, all kinds of timers available, so and help with pacing. And developing midpoints, just not, okay, you have 30 minutes to do this. Where are you going to be? Like your midpoint. Say you need 5 minutes to get ready. You're going to gather all your materials. That's, you know, you have 25 minutes. 10 minutes, you're going to check yourself, like midway, should you be about midway through? And then you need about 5 minutes at the end to like wrap it up, make sure it gets turned in. What are you going to do? So helping them understand that and really create that timeline. So working memory, tricky. So working memory is that short-term memory, right? We use it a lot in math. And so kids with working memory issues really struggle in math because they can't hold on to all of those. What do I do? It's that stupid long division, right? Dead mice smell bad. Divide, multiply, subtract, bring down, right? So helping kids get filed from their working memory into the long-term memory. That's really kind of what we want to happen. But so it starts with sensory memory, and if the information is important enough, it goes into working memory, and then it either gets reinforced into knowledge or it gets discarded. So if it's something you want kids to remember and to be able to pull out of their files later, their mental files, if it got discarded, like that's not going to be anywhere. So figuring out how you can intervene and support and scaffold the process so that they know what they need to, what's important to remember. So things like, let's go back here. So the players here, or the sub-skills, are registering, taking an environmental stimuli with the purpose of I'm going to do something with it. So teacher's talking, ma, 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 you know, that's all I hear. Because I don't know that she's saying anything I have to do anything with. But maybe if I said as the teacher, maybe I have a signal that helps them, like this is something you need to pay attention to. Or you could say, this is important. And say 1, 2, 3, you know, here are these 3 things. Hold, it's a short period of time when new stimuli need to be rehearsed. So that's where working memory and math really come in. Reinforce. So input deemed important enough, so it can be stored to become knowledge, needs to be practiced and rehearsed over and over again. So that's why we say strategies, using strategies. You teach them, you practice, and they rehearse and do it over and over again. And then you help them gauge, you help them reflect on how did I use the strategy. Synthesize, consolidating new information from recalled knowledge. So you can, the child can raise their hand and give an appropriate response. And then store, the filing cabinets when it goes into long-term memory. So you can see how these are pretty sequential, and they're not going to be able to get to store without getting through these other stages. And some of the strategies around these would be, if you want students to, like I said, take in and register, like what do I need to remember here? Develop some sort of signal for them. Teach it to them so they know it's a signal that they should pay attention to. And holding it, writing it down. So if you think about kind of UDL or visual, kinesthetic, auditory, right? Like if you can give it to them in different modalities, they may be able to hold on to it longer. So write it, see it. That's all. With reading, with reading instruction, there's a lot of like finger tapping to remember sounds. There's the writing in the air, the motor memory. So there are kinesthetic parts of instruction. And possible breakdown points. So you're going to see this in your kids when you're like, ooh, what's happening with them? So if the wrong information is deemed important, then the important information goes away. So they don't know which piece of information to hold on to. So you have to tell them that. You tell them that, you write it down. You might even, have them put some kind of outline strategy on their desk like you were talking about, but then keep pointing back to that. When overload, they get to brain freeze, right? They don't know what to do, and that's when you get the shutdown, the withdrawing, and then you end up with different problems, right? Rehearsing. So that's when they just haven't practiced enough. They don't know how to do it. They can't recall it. Synthesizing, they have misconsolidated material, so the components that can get discarded, the ones that you wanted them to keep. So when you ask them the next day, remember yesterday when we da-da-da-da-da, and they're like, or they say something to you that doesn't, it's where the class clown comes in. It's like he's trying to cover for the fact that he doesn't remember or she doesn't remember. Storing, filing cabinets of knowledge are random and uncategorized, so I don't even know what to look for. Nothing's connected. So that's that piece of instruction where you are helping them connect. Yesterday's, what you learned yesterday, you're talking about and you're connecting it, and it's throughout the day. And then retrieving the timeliness of one's timeliness around recall. It's that a kid who, goes around in circles and finally gets to, oh, that's what you were talking about. Then we have emotional control. So if you can't self-regulate through frustration, disappointment, and confusion, you're never going to get to done, right? You're never going to complete a task or activity or project. And here, the players or the sub-skills of this are perceive, one's belief. Like, do I think I can do this? So you can, as their teacher, you can point back to, remember you did this and this, you can do this, right? So scaffold that for them and give them some input. Working through challenges instead of quitting. It's hard because sticking with it and what are the strategies for that? You can incent kids, but sometimes, there's sometimes incenting them can backfire too, so you have to gauge that. Modulate, so you limit the intensity of one's emotions in working through a task. So It's not, you're not like, they're not intense on every single minute. You might actually schedule some breaks for them. Inhibit. They can block out distractions and other personal desires so that they can get something done. And flexing. They have the ability to look at their plan and say, oh, this isn't working like I thought. They can evaluate and reflect on it in that way, and then figure out if they need to modify it, and then self-correct, they actually do modify it. So it's recognizing it and doing it. So again, you can see how these players all are sequential. Like, you really need to build to self-correct. So, as you, here are some questions that are specifically looking at emotional control. So, anyone want to read that out loud? Go ahead. Thank you.
I'm almost through level 38 on this video game. I'm not getting off it now to do that stupid homework assignment.
So, which one, if you go back to perceive, persevere, modulate, inhibit, shift, and correct, like which one of those do you think players is not doing their job?
Inhibition.
Inhibit? Could be like, the video game is more important.
Not able to modulate.
Not able to modulate?
I would say inhibit.
Inhibit? Talk a little bit.
You don't have a sense of what each of the steps
Okay.
are. And so just the fact that it's taking a long time doesn't, you don't have that in context, right? You don't understand, okay, well, today I'm supposed to do this chunk, and tomorrow I'm gonna do that chunk, and actually, we're not supposed to be done with this for 3 weeks.
Okay. Yep. How about Margaret? This is a great one. Somebody can read this. Grr.
This chapter is so boring. Why does Mr. Smith always have to assign such useless work? He's such a crap teacher. I don't care if he gives me an F, he's such a
Charming. So what aspects of emotional control are kind of breaking down here?
Modulate.
Modulate, I heard.
And persevere.
Persevere, perceive,
Self-correct.
self-correct. Way down at the bottom, right? So it's so boring. Why does he always, like that whole, I think part of that perception piece, right? I mean, she's blaming it on the teacher, but it's really about, And one last one. Steve. Who wants to be Steve?
I don't care if we're supposed to have 3 references. 1 is enough, and I've already spent enough time on this stupid essay.
So, some emotional control issues there, right? Stupid assignment.
Inhibit and persevere.
Persevere, inhibit.
I think it's a failure to envision.
Yes, that whole, well, that is a planning piece, and so we're going to get to that next. So actually, let's just go on to the next one now that you've set that. So the players associated with planning. These are the most obvious, and we've kind of talked about these as study skills. As a matter of fact, I've always kind of been, throughout my 30 years of education and working in education, working with kids, and I've always kind of loved executive functioning. I don't know why, I'm a little nerdy on that. But we used to call it study skills. 30 years ago, who was talking about executive functioning? But these are the ones we often see. And when we talk about strategies for executive function, we often talk about these, the graphic organizers, the checklist, the this, the that. So let's look at these. Envision. What do I do, or what does my teacher want me to do? What should the final product look like? So again, it's that creating the picture. Help students create the picture. What does done look like? And get really specific about that. Organize. What time and materials do I need to do this? How am I going to gather them? How am I going to use them? Execute, prioritize to accurately determine what the most important components are so I can allocate my time. self-monitoring, so I'm tracking myself. I'm going to make the changes. That kind of goes back to what we were talking about with emotional control, right? And shifting or flexing. And then evaluating, reflect and self-assess. How does the vision match up with the final project? And what factors facilitated? It's that I can't tell you why this worked or didn't work for me. Yeah.
Where does the process piece, the recognition of the process? 'Cause right here, I feel like there's a lot of attention to the end, to the goal. But what if you don't know how to envision the process?
So that, I think that is, I mean, you could fit it in anywhere, but I think that is part of the envisioning. So what does done look like? Now, work backwards from there. So here's what done looks like. Next, if I go backwards from there, how am I going to get it done? Like, am I going to type this? Am I going to use the computer? Am I going to use what? Am I going to get together with a friend? Like, how am I going to get it done? And then back to the first step is what materials? Like, what is it that I need to organize to get this done? What materials? Is it paper, pencil? You know, if it's a project, I probably need my planner. I need to figure out the timing of it. So working backwards from that envisioning point does get back to the process.
Yes. What if it's not about the tangible things? What if it's about inside the thinking part of that? Like, okay, I get the sequence of things that I need to do to draft my piece and go through that process. But that whole first part.
Can you give an example?
Well, maybe it's even akin to that pre-brainstorming part. Like understanding where I need to go in my brain to think about, before I even think about what it needs to look like, I have to go somewhere inside my brain to access what there is being asked.
Yeah.
So, and that goes back to kind of our working memory and processing. And so, and it's tricky, like it's hard to isolate these and really work on them in isolation because they're so interconnected. But again, the more that you can scaffold and point out, like these are main ideas. You're reading this textbook, you know, look at what's bolded, look at the heading, go to the end of the chapter, look at the questions that are asked, and then go read, you know, so that they have some strategies for getting through the thinking part.
Do you have any suggestions for, like, I'm looking at this idea of planning, and I'm thinking of my kids who are like, the planning is like so overwhelming and exhausting, like to ask them to envision and like that would take so much out of them, they'd be too drained to even get started. Like
Right.
Where do you go with that?
So it does take time. It does take time.
And they're like so resistant to the idea of putting the time in because, like, oh my gosh, that is just too effortful.
So I think a couple things. I mean, everyone else could probably give you some comments and feedback too. But a couple things. I think that that if they see value in that, and that there's not that the strategy, learning how to use it, learning when to use it, learning to reflect on my use of it is important in your classroom. So and you take the time with it. I realize that it is difficult when you have many things to teach and many outcomes that you're trying to achieve. But for kids who are struggling with executive functioning skills, they have to have that time, and once they learn the skills, then you can remove some of those scaffolding, but it does take time in the beginning, definitely. And so if you value that in whatever way it is in your classroom, if it's a grade, I don't know what it is, but yeah.
I know that in my own experience, you have to model it all the time.
Yes, thank you for that.
Model. And having that final outcome available to them that they can go and look at, or even breaking it down. So here's what it looks like at the end, and we're going to put it in a PowerPoint, or what have you, to have it up. But our first step is to do blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So that's all we're going to do today. And just, it becomes more palatable and more feasible to them if you do take the time and break it down. Because in the end, what do you really want them to learn? Yeah. You want them to learn the process and then be proud of the fact that they completed something. And if that takes a long time, it takes a long time.
Yeah, and so thank you for that reminder. Like a strategy is a model, like show a worked assignment or a partially worked assignment or a task. And also, one of the things that when I was talking with parents all the time is, as parents and as teachers, talk about your process. Don't, and this is a cognitive connections, that group I told you about, they have a big thing too about, like, really be explicit about it, like role play, feeding your dog, right? Like, what are the steps you go through to feed my dogs? Well, at my house I have 2 golden retrievers and it's quite a process, but just kind of step through it and actually like physically walk through it. Well, I go over to the cupboard and I get the food out and I put it over, and I need the scoop, I need the measuring cup, so I'm going to go over here to this drawer and grab the measuring cups. I always put more water in it, so I'm going to turn on the water and let it get warmed up, so I walk over to the sink and do that. Like, it seems very foreign to us to have to do that, but that's how they start seeing that process. And I used to tell parents all the time too, is just as you're driving along with your student, if you pick them up after school, like, you're going to soccer practice, okay? Well, in order to get you to soccer practice, I have to go pick up your brother, and then we're going to go to soccer practice. You're going to be about 5 minutes early. I need you to wait for 5 minutes while I call so-and-so, because they're going to bring your sister home from dance, and then when I get home, I'm going to have to put the dinner in the oven. That process, if we don't kind of talk about that out loud, they don't know how it happens. Yeah.
Is there anywhere in the research anything about Linda Bell visualizing and verbalizing the program that I?
Yeah, visualizing and verbalizing.
Incredible.
Yes.
It changes like in a reading comprehension.
Yes.
And I'm not a support person out of the classroom,
Mhm.
but I highly
Yes.
suggest it and the steps. And it's like you were saying, they have structure words.
Yes.
And it helps kids use that visual memory and completely. It's not necessarily steps, but it's
Yeah.
the size and the colors and
Mhm.
the way you're describing a picture, but over and over and over. And then I do that with the text.
Yes.
They can't access it. I've worked in Northern City for a long time with English language learners, and you realize, wow, they're 5th grade level, in 5th grade, and their textbook is, way too
Yeah.
difficult. And over the course of like 6 months, though, it takes, 4 or 5 days a week.
Yes.
It's a lot, but
Right.
it's incredible.
Yeah, so that's visualizing and verbalizing. I did not put it in the resources, but that's a great tool, especially for teaching reading comprehension. And that's because kids with dyslexia, for example, they don't. When they're reading, you and I, when we're reading, we have a picture. We have this image in our brain of what we're reading. And we like, we picture it. And because of that, our comprehension is higher. So that program helps with that, visualizing and verbalizing, and Linda Bell. So just pointing out this again, here's one thing too. If you're, as you think about using this chart, if you're looking at a student and they're most of their issues are here in the emotional control column. Like, move this column all the way over here. So like start here and then start working your way. So it not only works sequentially this way, but it works sequentially across too. Does that make sense? So strategies. And we've talked a lot about different strategies, but so, yeah. Too much TV causes attention problems. So as we look at strategies, we're looking at environment, instruction, and then the actual task or activity. So allow for movement breaks in your classrooms. It's tricky, you know, like I don't know, lots of classrooms now have standing desks or adjustable desks, like kids can move up and down. They have the balls to sit on, they have fidgets. And I realize that, you know, fidgets sometimes, I mean, they become more of a distraction in some cases, but for kids who really need it, it really does help with attention. And sometimes, you know, a student comes up and says to you, I need to use the restroom. Well, you just used the restroom 20 minutes ago. It's really that they just need a break. So, you know, if they need to go run to the restroom or get a drink of water, like, you need to, you know your students and what they can do, but that's generally okay. They can come back and the more that you trust them with those kinds of things, the more trustworthy they will be. Signals, so we talked to you, yeah.
I just wondered if you had any suggestions of fidgets for younger students. I know with the older ones, but the young ones, like just their ability to manage the fidget is so, like I know they need something and yet they can't manage.
Does anybody have good ideas?
I love the just the flexible brains or like squishy foam brains. And I buy the gold ones, so I tell the kids they're using their golden flexible brain. For my kindergarten and first graders, I'm like, oh, do you need to borrow a flexible brain today?
Yeah.
And
they don't
fantastic.
Like, they're not tossed and rolled.
Sometimes, but we also work with the classroom teacher and because I teach resource, so but I also head up the check in, check out program at my school.
I don't know.
So it's like for kids that are struggling with behavioral challenges, and so working on socially appropriate ways to use them. And so I tell them if you're using it as a tool, then you're allowed to have it versus a toy. If the teacher sees it, it's a toy. If it's a tool, it's under the table.
Yeah, and so they're able to
they're
manage it.
really good about it. Occasionally they get taken away, but they lose it for a day, and then it's like, let's try again.
I actually, what I decided was we made some. So they're necklaces with elastic, and you put a tassel at the end. They have them like at Michael's, and you can fiddle the tassel. And then you have the pom-poms that are beads. So there's that part that you could fool with, and then just a little bit of beads. And I've tried this. They're wearing it. It's not going anywhere. And even if you pull on it and hit, I tried. The student's going to hit me. It's okay. But it stays on them and it doesn't go anywhere.
Any other? Yeah.
So Ted often uses, so find that a lot of students do better if they're able to engage large muscle groups rather than just fine motor muscle groups. And so like a small soft football, a small soft basketball, they can squeeze it under their arm and be applying some energy and burning off some of those large muscles. They can stick it between their knees.
Like the Nerf kind of, or foam? Okay.
Squeeze it between their knees, and it's not visible, but they're able to work out.
Yeah.
A lot of these kids are some form of kinesthetic learner. They have to engage group and connection.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
We use rubber bands at school.
The big bands on the,
My daughter really likes, looks like you buy them at Bed Bath & Beyond or Zillow, and they're sort of plastic silicone wash pads that have bristles on them. And so they're soft, but very tactile. And they don't have lots of little pieces. And so it's one thing to hold on to, and you can throw it in the dishwasher when it's filed.
Thank you. So classroom expectations, teach and reference and reinforce those. We're really good about teaching them at the beginning of the year, and then we kind of we forget, right? So it's keep on coming back to those, and it should be visual too, not just written, but some kind of visual reminder for them. And try not to, you can go to recess as soon as you finish the assignment. Try not to do that, especially with kids who have attention issues. Like, you're not going to get any learning out of them. They're just going to do something to finish it. As you look at instruction, it's that direct and explicit, and from that kind of works across the board, right? That I do it, we do it, you do it, and then provide immediate feedback. The immediate feedback is really important, especially if it's positive, right? It's that 5 to 1 thing, right? 5 positives for 1 negative. Important points clearly identified. Like, we talked about this already. I'm about to say something that you need to remember. You know, so somehow signal to the students that it's important. It's a main idea. Vary your instructional delivery. You know, think about some of the universal design for learning components. Think about that visual, auditory, kinesthetic, so that it's not all. Sometimes they're listening to you. Sometimes they're working in small groups. Sometimes they're doing some seat work. Sometimes they're up and moving around the classroom in a certain way. So just vary that, and then vary calling on students, which I'm sure you already do. If you look at tasks and assignments, keep them brief. Or I think somebody up here said, oh, maybe it was you, said, chunk and say, this is what we're going to, here's the project, this is what we're doing today. Provide immediate feedback. Again, that's about accuracy. It's not, you're not talking like content. It's not like evaluative kind of feedback. It's not like, oh, that was really good, or that's a work. It's like you followed the directions. Emphasis on quality versus quantity, and allow extra time if they need it. And so that gets tricky. You have to figure that out in your classrooms, and I get that. And you also don't want to say, you don't want to like make a big deal of it in the class. You don't want them to feel singled out or, spotlight on them, like I'm the only kid who needs extra time. Like, you need to work that out in a way.
That's a question I was wondering. I'm a academic support coordinator, but I work with teachers because some kids have IEPs. A lot of kids have IEPs, and they get a modified. They don't have to do the 4 paragraphs. They have to do 2. And so how does that play into you don't want to make a big deal about it. This is middle school or in 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and they get really they don't want to be pointed out because they're doing less. Mm-hmm. Is there a way, I don't know, this is a random question, I know. Is there a way to help with that?
Anybody have ideas about that?
Well, just with my students, so I have kindergarten through 8th grade, and so for my middle school students that don't want to be specifically pointed out, but they also get overwhelmed with the general classroom directions. Is like, remember, they're talking to the whole class, so I'll have a one-on-one conversation with them and just coach them on that. Like, remember, you have a separate set, and this is the expectation for you. And if you're ever confused, then you go directly to the teacher, or like a lot of my kids are uncomfortable asking for that direct help, and so I'll have them practice emailing. So because I want to empower them to be advocates for themselves. But at the same, so it doesn't help them if I solve the problem. Yeah. So I'm like, I helped them with writing a appropriate email asking for help, and that's been a really good strategy.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
thank you.
So look at processing. So problems often look overwhelming at first. The secret's to break them down, right? For example, read this entire, then you focus on the reading first section. Oh, I ask myself, do I even care? No. So looking at processing environment, use the same type of materials. If whatever's routine is going to be easier, they're not taxing all of their processing and working memory on that. Provide a safe area or time for your student to ask questions. That goes back to the question that was just raised, and how can you, like the email thing, and helping them compose an email, but they send it, they take responsibility for it. Stick to daily routines. Have daily routines and stick to them. Provide visuals. In terms of instruction, give them time, give students time to respond if you're asking questions. Allow think time. Once upon a time in my classroom there was a light bulb that we put up while it was think time, and nobody could raise their hand or answer a question while that was up, right? And then I took it down, then they could. So provide that preview and pre-teach. So it's that whole front-loading piece of what you're doing. Tell them what you want them to learn. Like today, you're going to learn this strategy for keeping track of time while you're working on a project. And then chunk it for them to do that. Provide outlines, copies of slides, models of completed assignments. That came up, models of completed assignments. Check in frequently with the students. I know that gets tricky, especially when you have a class of 30 or whatever you have now. Slow down. Like stop and pause. Yeah.
A question about the check-in. Because I see when I check in with students in the classroom, often I get, yeah, I'm good, or I'm okay. Like how the check-in often either makes them feel more anxious or is a deflection.
So it's one of the things I think is that if you do it regularly and frequently, and not just with those students that you tagged, but it's like everyone kind of gets some check-in time, that doesn't make them feel so singled out. And also, if you ask them some specific questions, show me what strategy you're using. Try to ask, and I actually at the end of this, one of the tools, we're not going to go over them, but I put some kind of reflecting or prompting questions at the end of your slides. That might help too. Develop self-advocacy skills. So that's kind of where you were going with the email. Like,
I was just going to say something along those lines. What I've been finding helpful is making like a really positive response to whenever anybody does ask a question or check in or acknowledges that they don't know. I'm like, so-and-so just did the smartest thing. They noticed they didn't know. You can't learn anything until you realize you have something you need to learn and you didn't know. Like, like really making that the positive that we're working towards, and that makes them more likely to do it.
That's right, thank you. So the tasks or the assignments, subtly allow extra time. That's kind of what we've been talking about, right? Allow use of technology, typing or dictation software or whatever. Like what's going to help these kids who have processing issues get the stuff out? Create some volume. Modify the assignments to make them shorter. Provide a checklist or rubric for assignments. That rubric is really nice because it shows the students exactly what you're looking for. And that's, they need that. Grade on mastery, not in completed assignments. So that goes back to do these 50 math questions, right? That's what we used to do in school, right? But maybe they only need to do 5. You just want to know that they've learned that content. Use timers. There's lots of millions of timers out there. Cognitive Connections, that organization I told you about, also has their whole take on timers and time robbers and how to use your time and how to use the analog clock. Lots of people say use the analog clock because that way you can really see time, moving. Chunk big assignments into smaller tasks. We've done talked a lot about that. Working memory. Again, lots of these strategies work in lots of different ways. So use the same type of materials. Provide a safe time and area for students to ask questions. Stick to daily returns. Any of those things that are not going to task working memory, right? Instruction. Go back to that visualization. Like if they can picture it, they're going to rely a lot less on having to remember all the words that have been said or all the numbers. Use multisensory methods, like visual, auditory, kinesthetic. Repeat information, make connections to learning, make connections for them, especially in that pre-teaching and previewing. Play visual and auditory memory games, especially in the younger grades, it's fun, right? Concentration and all those kinds of things. Regularly ask students to reflect back what they heard. So, and I'm sure you all do that. That's just one of the things that I see teachers doing everywhere. Like, okay, so what are the 3 things you're going to do now? Teach strategies and regular review when and how to use. Again, like keep going back to that. Take time to teach the strategies because they're not going to use them. Practice them, practice them, practice them. And then let them choose. Give them some, like, a strategy may not work for them, so let them choose the strategies that work for them and then develop this toolkit. They can develop their toolkit of strategies. The tasks, break them down. Short-term deadlines, check in frequently. Reduce the overall amount of info to be stored in working memory. So that's why it's really nice. You use Google Classroom, any kind of learning management systems, like record stuff there so students can go back to it and find the information again. Encourage use of strategies, make that part of the assignment. It's not just your 3-paragraph composition. Tell me what strategies you use and make that part of the assignment. Shorten the task, provide partially work, we've talked about that. Emotional control. You EBC folks probably can tell a lot about, teach us a lot about all this, but designate a calm corner or spot in your classroom so kids can go there autonomously. They can go there. And there might be things in that corner, it's like sensory items to use. Provide vocabulary for feelings. And that all the SEL curriculum that's out, social emotional learning, there's a lot of helping kids put words to how they feel. Mini breaks, establish routines. I'm not going to go through all this. You guys can read. Tasks and assignments. Again, universal design for learning comes in here. If you don't know very much about that, I encourage you to learn some more about UDL. Avoid rigid deadlines where you can, and give time. Instead of having something that's due tomorrow, make it due in 2 or 3 days and then check in. Planning. Again, this goes back to the kind of study skills piece, right? One thing, how many of you put your schedules posted in your classroom? Yeah, I bet a lot of you do that. That's awesome. And even putting times up there. I know it gets tricky because kids are like, wait a minute. You said we're going to 9 to 9:15 on that, and we're not. So, but they start to see how time passes and how you use time. And also, to take it the next step further for a specific student, you might copy that and put it on their desk, and they might check off as you go through each portion of the day. They check off, so it's right there in front of them, and they can see it. Yeah.
One of the things that we do in my classroom is if we have to change the schedule, then we make that an overt discussion. Right? This thing took 10 minutes longer than we thought it would, so we're going to move this here a little differently. We erase, here's how we changed it. Are there any questions? Any suggestions? I always ask for suggestions.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. Designate organized spaces. It's hard if you're not an organized person yourself, like how do you organize your classroom? And some of your kids might even be able to help you do that too. But there's this classroom organization checklist the Responsive Classroom does that's pretty cool. Teach them how to use a planner. And there's all kinds of electronic planners. I put a copy of a planner in your notes. Again, that's from Cognitive Connections. Visualize what done looks like. Get ready, do, done, get done. That get done piece is the turning it in piece. So it's done, now what do you do? Use color-coded. There's all kinds of strategies around color-coded folders that you can do. We talked a little bit about Google Classroom or a learning management system where kids can refer back to the assignment. The whole time management piece, I added this in here for planning strategies because this is a big issue for a lot of our kids. Teach them how to transition between activities and devote time to doing that, practicing it. Develop time awareness. Time Robbers, Cognitive Connections talks about use the analog clock and the hidden aspects of time management. So you have 30 minutes to do this assignment, but okay, it's going to take 5 minutes to collect the materials. It's going to take 5 minutes for me to wrap it up and get everything put away and get it turned in. Like, just help them think through the process. A note about planners. Just make sure you can't just give them a planner, you just really have to teach them. And lots of times, if you have a dot camera where you're actually doing it with them, or laminate your big, make it huge and laminate or write on the board, whatever. And make sure it includes the assignment, the name of the assignment, the materials needed, the time required. That's a piece that's not often there. You can say, this shouldn't take you more than 15 minutes. If it does, do what you can do in 15 minutes and talk to me about it tomorrow, or something like that. There's the planner that Cognitive Connections does. It's kind of cool for different reasons. These are the reframing scripts that I talked about. So when you're checking in with a student, these would be the kinds of things you might be able to use and say. I like the way you stuck with that math problem, even though it frustrated you. What are some ways you can remember everything you have to bring home at the end of the day? Tell me 3 things you can do if you start your math homework and realize you can't remember exactly what you're supposed to do. Like those kinds of things. So that brings us full circle back to those EF coaches, right? So I find that chart is a really nice tool for helping me think about students and where their areas of breakdown are, and then thinking about strategies according to that. A couple things. One is we are doing a mini conference in February. It's a Saturday. It'll be at our South Bay location in San Jose, 9 to 2. There will be a track for educators and for parents. The track for educators includes 3 different topics, and you choose one and stick with it through the day. So one is executive functioning for the classroom. One is behavior, managing behavior in your classroom. And the third one is differentiating instruction. So that is happening in February. You can start, that's online, and you can sign up for that now. Also, in the materials that you got when you checked in out at the front desk, there's a survey. We'd love for you to take a minute to fill out the survey. And just want to say that one of the things that we're able to provide these sessions free because of generous donors. And so one of the things that really helps us in terms of reporting back to them, how's it going, is that we have this information and data from the survey. So it's really helpful if you can take a minute. Thank you for coming this evening.